Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. My name is Dana Bookbinder, and we are going to be talking about City Nature Challenge 2021. Woohoo! It's happening. EcoSpark's the regional coordinator, so this event will discuss Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area. But just so you know, it's a global event, and the things that we talk about will take place all around the world over the next 4 days. So you may have come across this through a number of different posts. City Nature Challenge is co-facilitated by EcoSpark with the Natural History Museum, the Los Angeles County, and the California Academy of Sciences. Just a little bit of history. They launched the event 6 years ago. It moved global. So from California, it's spread all around the world. And we have more than 400 cities and peri-urban areas participating this year in a global event. And in fact, the City Nature Challenge website invites people, even if they're in a rural area, to take part in the global count of wildlife and wild species that are outside our homes. This is taking place in the pandemic because it can be done independently. So you don't need to be gathered in a group like in a typical year we would have events outdoors all together. You can do this with your family and friends at home and even on your own just by snapping photos of the critters that you're seeing near you. So just a technical note, if you're just joining us, we are recording the video today, and we will be sharing that and all of the resources via email to all of the registrants. And you can find it on EcoSpark's YouTube channel after today. We are happy to monitor the chat for any questions, and I think that'll be the easiest way to get your response because I've got a few colleagues here joining me today. Thanks so much, Holly and Carolyn and Eliza and Paul and everyone. We are really excited to get started. So without further ado, we acknowledge the land where EcoSpark has its office is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We acknowledge that the land where EcoSpark runs programs is the traditional territory of many nations and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And we're hoping that with the City Nature Challenge, folks can explore all of the different species that share the land with us, and we can learn a little bit more today about everything in our environment. So EcoSpark, just a short intro to who we are. I work for a charity called EcoSpark that empowers people to protect and sustain the local environment. So we're based in Toronto and have programs throughout the Greater Toronto Area and during the pandemic throughout Ontario, even beyond. We're doing some global events. In all of our programs, we encourage people to get outside, discover nature, act to protect it, and really institute change on an individual through community level, through global scales to make a difference wherever they are. We do this with students in grades 6 through 12 through a couple of programs. I'm lucky to be joined here today by our Changing Currents team who are facilitating, thanks Holly, facilitating in a typical year in-field work with students. So your class could sign up to have a workshop where the students can try on those big fishing waders and use our equipment to get into a local stream near your school and explore water quality in a hands-on way. Similarly, the School Watch program that I work with a few other people can host students to get outside on their school grounds and improve habitat by monitoring pollinators, birds, other local species very close to where you're located. And all of these programs are curriculum linked, so a great way to get some environmental education experience out in the field. During the pandemic, we offer modified remote virtual options of both of these programs, and you can check out those at ecospark.ca. It's been a very busy spring, but we do have a few openings left for spring if you want to get your class excited about some local environmental data that we can look at closer with them. Finally, EcoSpark is involved with adult volunteers as well. So you might have been part of this, and if not, I hope you'll learn about our Park Watch resources, also available online at ecospark.ca. We had a big partnership with Humber Arboretum and with the City of Toronto Community Stewardship Program, so volunteers who help out in the city parks, to remove an invasive plant called Phragmites without pesticides, without herbicides. That was a very fun, successful project, and we have a report up that you can view if you're interested in getting your local group some more ideas. The Park Watch Guide will also give you more ideas for how to do projects like City Nature Challenge with your group and lead them throughout the year. It's not just this week. And our Greenbelt Youth Ambassadors are an incredibly inspiring group of youth, high school students and up, who are, even during the pandemic, getting involved in active advocacy for the Greenbelt, for this sort of green lung that gives us clean air. It's all of the woodlands and the head of our streams all around our urban areas. So these youth are really inspiring, helping to protect that and get others involved in work for the Greenbelt. They have some excellent webinars too. All right, so the moment you've all been waiting for, April 30th, today is the launch of City Nature Challenge. So as I mentioned, this is a global event. Anyone around the world can take part in these 4 days by observing local wildlife and then sharing those records on a citizen science platform called iNaturalist. So in this talk today, we'll go through, I will do a brief intro to iNaturalist in case you're a new user, just to let you know more about what that entails. And then we'll have a few kind of fun tricks and tips for photographing fun critters that might be near you, even thinking creatively about how to participate from home if you can't get very far afield. I promise you there's nature all around. So you can take part by adding photos anytime until May 3rd. And following that, EcoSpark will be involved with sharing records, distributing what we found, and hopefully celebrating with you between May 4th and May 10th to learn more about those critters that people have submitted. So we'll also touch on how you can help identify what people are submitting if they didn't know the name of what they found, and then learning more about what you discovered. If you're new to citizen science, just to note, this is also called community science, and the word citizen here refers to a citizen of the world, right? Like everybody helping out together. We are studying nearby nature. It's very democratic. The reason I love it and the reason I got into it is because I love that an observation that an 8-year-old makes with a smartphone in their backyard can be validated and included in scientific research. So all of the data is shared in online databases and anybody can access the data, which means that even teams of professional researchers are going in and they're interested in what people are finding near home locally. And then sometimes published reports are relying on this information, which is really interesting. Even as tools to learn more about science and inquiry, if you're a teacher, thank you for joining today. EcoSpark does have a number of resources that help interpret citizen science for students and get them thinking about how to ask questions around about the world around us. You can use it to explore and test your own hypotheses. So if you're curious what's eating your cabbages every year and you want to take some snapshots of the eggs on your leaves and learn what insect pest that might be, that's an example of citizen science in action. You can also use citizen science to help solve more global problems. So we're learning that a lot of the data can inform our understanding of climate change impacts. For example, looking at the timing of when flowers are blooming in the spring helps us learn about if plants are keeping up with the shift in temperatures that we're seeing on a global scale, and which plants might thrive with a range shift where they can actually expand their range, and which ones might be stopped by that change in temperatures. All right, so we're going to take a little moment to do a nature observation using the chat feature. I would just like you to share any plant, animal, other wild critter, it could be a mushroom, anything that you've noticed outside this week, and write it down in the chat, please. For example, I saw some American robins eating worms with my 4-year-old, who you might hear in the background today. Speaking of wildlife. So you can access your chat with the chat button and add in any observation that you found. Lots of birds, awesome. Oh, somebody has a bird bath out. Thank you. Garlic mustard everywhere. All right, garlic mustard, yeah, an invasive species. So luckily when we use iNaturalist, it will automatically flag species that are invasive or causing problems, so that we can learn about which species is which, and then that flags it for land managers to be able to stop an invasion before it starts for some areas, or record the extent of where invasive species might be headed. Coltsfoot, a nice wildflower that's also non-native but beautiful, and one of the earliest to come out. So here in Toronto, when you see coltsfoot, that's one of the flowers that is being tracked to look at climate change as we see what date it flowers every year. Cherry blossoms, absolutely. I just learned that Baltimore Orioles are actually using the cherry blossoms, like they drink the nectar. So plants that might even support native species as they come through. All right, keep going, you guys. This is great. The reason that I've asked you to participate in a nature observation is because people say, what should I take a picture of? Like, I don't have a fancy camera. I don't know if I can take part. All of those observations would be excellent for citizen science and for the whole idea behind City Nature Challenge. So I like to think about very simple ways to get started. And my 2-year-old this morning at breakfast looked out the window and said, a squirrel. And that was my first City Nature Challenge observation that I had heard from anyone. So anybody can do this. It is very important to connect with people during these hard times. And I think the City Nature Challenge gives us a great way to draw out those connections. For City Nature Challenge, I'd ask you to think about ways that you can involve your community. So feel free to share our resources. We're on social media all week, and get some people maybe who haven't really been in your circle lately, or who might be interested in nature but don't know that much about it, to take part. You can ask students, what is this neat bug? You can work with your school to identify birds, even from home. And we'll talk about an opportunity with that later. And you can compare, right? So if you're looking for a species this year, try and make it an annual event and see how many species you can find next year. Comparing with your family from their childhood, which species did you see where you were located and when, across time and space. And then finally, we're thinking as EcoSpark about action that we can take. So the whole idea is monitoring biodiversity so that we can conserve it and really help these species and hopefully attract more to our region for future years. So the way that this works, if you're new to citizen science, it's just collecting and submitting observations of nature. So you don't need to have a device, but for City Nature Challenge, it's photography based. So with your camera or your smartphone, you would take a photo of whatever it is that you're seeing outside. And it can be as short as a 10-minute window where you're heading out and snapping something nearby, and then sharing that with others. As we share the records, we're able to see what all of our neighbors are finding, comparing it with Brazil and Denmark and everywhere else around the world to see what it looks like as a snapshot of our global species that are active right now. The City Nature Challenge takes place on a particular citizen science database called iNaturalist. So this is a free project available online. EcoSpark uses it for almost all of our programs, and we encourage people to get involved because there's a lot of great resources through their website at inaturalist.ca. EcoSpark has an Ontario-wide observation page where we've been gathering records, thousands and tens of thousands of records of wildlife around Ontario. You can get involved with iNaturalist through one of their 2 apps. So if you are interested in taking a device outside, you can download one of their free apps. The iNaturalist app, you need an account. So this is for people aged 14 and up. Teachers, we recommend you make an account for the class and just use your own account. And then students can send you photos and you can submit for them onto iNaturalist. They also produce an app called Seek, which is more of a learning tool. And Seek can show you the names of species, for example, and tell you more information about what you're observing outdoors, but it doesn't need to be tied to a personal email. And so that's for all ages. That's very family friendly. If you enjoy the Seek app, and it does have some other qualities that I'll tell you about, there are benefits to using the Seek app, and you want to participate in iNaturalist City Nature Challenge, you can link your Seek observations to your iNaturalist account. So when you log into Seek, you'll have the option to link this to an iNaturalist account, and then everything you gather in Seek would be stored in iNaturalist. Otherwise, if you just use Seek and you don't have an account, you're not going to be able to save your records and share them with others. Does that make sense? Any questions about the difference between iNaturalist and Seek apps? You can type them in the chat, or if you're comfortable, unmute and ask. Okay, and we'll look a little bit more in detail at this. So what it looks like for iNaturalist, the whole idea behind City Nature Challenge is that we're asking people to submit a record. It can be a record of a butterfly, like this orange butterfly that you see. It could even be a sound if you're hearing frogs calling or birds calling, but some sort of evidence of what you've discovered outdoors. For iNaturalist, you will need to record what you saw. So it could be that piece of evidence. You could also give the species name if you know it, and when you saw it. So using the app, this is automatic and it will just indicate the date right there. If you're outside with paper and pencil and your camera, and then you want to come back and load it, then you'll have to put all these details into iNaturalist. So just make sure you're keeping track of when you saw it. And then that piece of evidence. So as you're using an app outside, you can just open the camera or the recording option through the app. Otherwise, use the camera feature of your phone and you can submit it that way. So it lets you select it from your phone's gallery, for example. Where you saw it. So just a note on the coordinates. It will provide an accuracy that's somewhat generalized, so not quite at a specific address, but you can choose to obscure it further. If you don't want your location known, you can include a setting that makes it less accurate, but say from the city block, for example, is where you saw your organism. So just check that you're comfortable with what the coordinates are. And a note on that, if there is a sighting of a very unusual plant or animal, then iNaturalist will obscure the location of those rare sightings so that, for example, we're not getting people to go out in the woods to find the very last Venus flytrap or some other kind of rare plant to destroy it. So there is that kind of protection in there for our rare species. And then finally, iNaturalist is with that account. So your email account would be used to help you track which species are there and to communicate with others about what records you're putting in. The way that the Seek app works is a little bit more simple. If you have it on your phone, then you would just point the device at whatever you see, like that orange butterfly. And it compares that image with all of the images that volunteers have submitted in the past to iNaturalist of orange butterflies, and churn through. And if everything's going well, it will spit out a species suggestion for you. So in real time, it will say, we think this is a monarch. Do you agree? And in that way, you can get a sort of real-time estimate or species identification suggestion. It's not always perfect, but it can give you really good clues. This is great for English as a second language learners to kind of learn more familiar species names for the area, for naturalist clubs, for schools. And then it's really fun. You can also collect these virtual badges. So as you observe, for example, insects, you would get an insect badge, and so on. EcoSpark's Naturalist project is run year-round. So there's a big push until Monday to gather as many observations as we can. But if you want to use this with your class or your group, or if you're just curious with your family, please continue taking part. And EcoSpark's iNaturalist project is a fun one to join if you want to see some interesting journal updates and what other people are tracking in Ontario. You would go to this link and hit join. To participate in City Nature Challenge, it doesn't matter if you join a project. Anyone in this geographic area who's submitting to iNaturalist before Monday ends will be included in the City Nature Challenge count.
Dana, just one quick question. Are there resources in French?
For iNaturalist, I believe they have some, but I don't have the link for that right now. If anyone does and can share it in the chat, please feel free. EcoSpark's page, unfortunately, is not. Thanks, good question. Just a quick step back here. I've been talking about biodiversity, and I want to remind us why we're doing this in the first place. Biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth. So it includes all those living things, but also the ways that they interact with each other. So as we're gathering this list of species, it's not just to have a big impressive list. It's actually thinking about where things are located and why, and maybe the behaviors. So there are areas in iNaturalist where you can include notes. And if you are an iNaturalist user, this is a good time to sort of step up your records and try and include more information. For example, you could say that the swallowtail butterfly is feeding at the flower. So then we know that it's found a pollen source here, a nectar source here, excuse me. Biodiversity overall is something that we're excited about because it supports clean water, clean air, habitat for wildlife, our food and agriculture. So for example, healthy pollinators, of course, are supporting us by pollinating our crops as well. Climate change protection, so mitigating floods, healthier ecosystems are able to store more carbon, all sorts of protections to make a more resilient environment, and human well-being. So this challenge is a really fun way to get people involved and reduce your stress as you get outside, and hopefully you'll take the initiative to spend some more time outdoors and improve your well-being. In addition, we are watching to monitor species that could be at risk. So biodiversity in Ontario, we've learned from records such as yours that you're sharing that we have more than 200 plants and animal species now classified as at risk of becoming locally extinct. So including nearly all of Ontario's turtle species. This is due in part to loss of habitat, as you'll see here in our area. That's one of the main causes of decline. So it's more important than ever that we're tracking species and helping to flag when we see species in the environment so that we can keep track of protecting them. Overall, we're looking at biodiversity at a global scale because we found that areas with high diversity are in turn able to support additional benefits, even more species. So for example, in the forest above, you'll see that the more diverse forest habitat with trees at all different levels, for example, is in turn supporting those large-bodied vertebrates, all of the silhouetted animals that are making use of that forest. Whereas below, where diversity of the forest is reduced and there aren't as many plant species, there are fewer animal species. And just a note, if you look at the inset for pictures A and B, that overhead view, it looks identical. So we can't just take Google Images and say this area has a lot of diversity and this one doesn't, because sometimes from the air they would look identical. We really need people like you on the ground to get those snapshots of life right close to home to understand the full picture. We have some pristine areas in southern Ontario. This is Algonquin Park, and I'm jealous of anyone who gets to go canoeing there. I haven't been yet. And so that high diversity in more pristine areas is certainly worth protecting and celebrating. But we have biodiversity very close to home as well. The Toronto Biodiversity Series is a wonderful set of guides that's available free from libraries, and they're all online. And so if you're exploring this weekend and you want to learn more about these different taxonomic groups, these different types of animals and plants, this is a great place to start because they'll give you some of the local species to look out for and teach you a little bit more about where you might find them. And they're right under our feet, right? This can be kind of subtle. Some of the smallest ones are some of the more interesting ones. All right, so let's get into some of the nitty gritty of how you might make an observation for iNaturalist. Any photo of any wild critter or plant or mushroom, anything that you can find outside would count. But we're trying to get more of them that are easy to identify so that researchers and the general public can bring those base level casual observations up to what's called research grade. So a research grade observation is one that two different people have looked at and said, I can for sure identify that that is a dandelion, for example. So we get the species identification from two different groups checked off, and then it's a research grade level that can be used for publications, for example, and it just helps verify those observations. So obviously, if you had like a really blurry photo of a yellow flower, it might be harder to identify that as a dandelion. Whereas if it's a more clear in focus picture, then it's easier to identify. So we're going to look at some tips to make those clear photos part of our observations this weekend. So a lot of these come from the Canadian Wildlife Federation. They have a great guide with more details. And I think we're sharing links in the chat. We'll also email afterwards to anybody who registered for this if you're looking for those specific links. So what I like to do for approaching, sometimes these critters can be really fast. You think about a bird flying overhead and you weren't sure if it was a hawk or a vulture or what, and now it's gone. Sometimes the best thing to do is just snap a photo as fast as you can to start out with. So you have something. Something is better than nothing. But then, because of the way iNaturalist accepts multiple photos for each record, try and get additional photos and improve them as you go. So let's look at, if we've got a frog, we could take a photo, or a toad. You could use take a snapshot as soon as you see it, and then walk normally so you don't startle the critter, the butterfly or whatever. Just walk normally and approach to a safe distance, and then snap another photo. That way, if it hops off or whatever, in the meantime, you still got something. General tips and good reminders are to try and photograph with good light. Keep the sun at your back so that it's shining on the critter instead of lots of shadows. And that will help you get better colors. For different taxonomic groups, there might be colored markings on the critter that help to identify it. If two look similar, but you can see clearly what the coloration of the spots is, that can be helpful. Depending on what you're photographing, you can think about maybe putting a background behind it. So if a plant part can be held out a little bit so that you can get a clear photo of the tip of the branch, then the buds that are at the tip that make it easier to identify the plant would be easier to see. And as I mentioned, you can take multiple photos. So think a little bit about how you might do this. If you can get, as with this beetle, if you can get a front shot of the head, top, maybe side. For plants, maybe the bottom of ferns has those little dots all over them that are actually part of the reproductive part of the fern. So even the underside of leaves can help you with the identification. So a few different shots, if you can, from different angles. For birds, I've read that the head color and shape is the most useful for identifying birds. That makes sense. So whatever you can do to get a few different shots and then submit them in the same record. So you're not going to say dandelion A as one record, dandelion B, but it's the same one from a different angle as a separate record. Instead, use all of those photos. You can say, I have multiple photos of the same species in one record. You want to center the critter in the frame, so no little squirrel tails flying off. You want it right in the middle. And then you can also crop the photo before submitting. So this is a really helpful trick. If you've got that big photo of a butterfly and there's lots of grass showing all around it, crop in and then submit the cropped photo, and that will make it easier to identify. You can also learn more about how the species can be identified by taking part in this challenge and learning about what makes one snail different from another snail. Then you'll know which part of the snail to photograph. So that guide that we shared shows you some tips for the different groups, and we'll go through a little bit one by one for some of the more common types of species that you'll see. In addition, just a reminder that we're looking for wild species. So we already know what a domestic cat looks like, and they're great photos to share on social media, but let's try and focus this challenge when you're submitting to iNaturalist with wild species. No zoo animals, no human faces, a reminder for students in particular, and that's why we recommend teachers gather their student observations and then encourage the students to have high quality photos before we submit into iNaturalist. And then people ask about garden plants. So interestingly, we're more excited about the weeds growing in your garden that arrive there of their own accord than we are about cultivated plants like tulips. The reason for that is because from iNaturalist standpoint, those weed seeds are part of our local system that are going to be more subject to the spring timing and the rain level that's here. Whereas the tulip that came from a garden center, it might be a hybrid, it has a different origin for that seed. So if you are keen on photographing things that are cultivated, like a tree that you planted in your front yard and you want to identify what species it is, that's fine. But there's a checkbox where you can indicate this was a cultivated or a captive species. So that will help distinguish it in the iNaturalist data set, so we can kind of keep track which ones are wild. All right, so then we're going to spend the next, 10 minutes going through a few different groups, just for ideas for where you might find some fun critters, specifically right now, the end of April, early May for our area.
Dan, I just want to chime in quickly. Sorry. Just in
Thank
the chat on iNaturalist and the CCAP, there are options. Thanks, Kate, for sharing that you can switch the language so that you can get them in French or other languages as well too. So, and thank you for that. And then I did share a link in the chat for biodiversity, all those Toronto booklets that Dana showed on the screen earlier as well too. So.
Thanks, Holly. And great, thank you for that tip. I didn't realize you could just switch to French, so that's perfect. Okay, reptiles and amphibians. So on the left here, you can see a salamander, the eastern redback salamander. This is a very small critter. It's only about, an inch, but it can often be found in our urban parks. So I've seen them in High Park in Toronto. And you can see them earlier in the spring than some of the other like basking turtles that you can picture in the summer coming out. Typically, we get more sightings of those a little bit later. So if you're looking for salamanders, we encourage everybody to stay on the trails because even by walking on the soil, we're compressing the soil and might even crush these little guys by going off trail. But if you can, maybe in your own backyard or in the park carefully, flip over logs and see if you can find any salamanders to photograph. That's a great spot to look. And then return the log carefully after you flipped it so that it's making that nice habitat for them to use later in the year. Other salamanders, so this salamander lays its eggs under the logs, but other salamanders in the spring are laying their eggs in vernal pools, which is like a low-lying area that gathers water for part of the year and is dry for the other part of the year. So you can imagine the salamander eggs there are free from fish predators, right? Because it dries up other times of year. So if you have any water source near you, little puddles, look for like this gelatinous mass of eggs, and you could photograph that to add to iNaturalist. That's a fun thing in the spring to keep an eye out for. It looks like white jello for the salamander eggs. Also, I mentioned calls. So it doesn't have to be a photograph, it could be a sound recording. This one on the right, if you've guessed, is the spring peeper, and they are going full throttle. This is a tiny frog with a little X on the back, and they sing with a really, really loud voice as they're starting their mating season. You will hear them peep, 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 or much louder if there's lots of them. So you could take a recording and add that. I think Sarah also saw a garter snake ball, a mating ball recently in North York. So it would have been within the last couple of weeks, the garter snakes have been coming out, and it's their mating season. And often as they emerge after the winter, they're all gathered near each other. So if you see one, look for some others. We also have options if you're housebound or if you're just curious. I love this topic. The wildlife of our homes is an emerging field in citizen science as people realize that some of the least studied species are the ones that are right closest to us. So for example, the ant that you see here on the right was discovered by citizen science students in Denmark as the first invasive ant coming in there, an exotic species that had not been discovered by professional scientists, but some kids doing an ant project were able to photograph and identify it. And this is an ant that we'll find here as well. It's the kind that is making nests right under our structures and into our homes. So you can look close to home. The one on the left is a cellar spider. So if you head down into the basement and look up in the corners, maybe we can get some more creative entries for our biodiversity count. The spring butterflies have been coming out, and these are really interesting. The one on the left, the northern azure, this is the spring azure, and it's mostly distinguished from the summer azure because of it's out now, whereas the other one will fly later in the year. So by tracking citizen science observations and records, people were able to actually distinguish and see if there are two different separate species because of all the records from people taking photos. It's a very small butterfly. a larger one that you might be familiar with on the right is called the mourning cloak. And all these photos are from even the last couple of days onto our iNaturalist account. So likely to see them soon. The mourning cloak actually overwinters in its adult form. So that's why we see them so early in the spring. They're feeding on the sap of trees early in the spring, and they kind of look battered because they've made it through an Ontario winter here to complete their life cycle in a very unusual way instead of overwintering in the egg. Our spring migrant bird species are coming through. So there's kind of a big pulse of birds every spring and fall as the migrants go from south to north and north to south, passing right over us. So it's an exciting time to be keeping an eye out for these. On the left, there's a tiny one, the ruby-crowned kinglet. And these little guys can flit near the top of the trees. On the right, we've got the sapsucker, yellow-bellied sapsucker woodpecker. And so talking about diversity, these are both insect eaters, I've learned. And the one on the left, it's gleaning insects off of leaves, maybe finding little tiny spiders that are up hanging on the leaves. Whereas the sapsucker is going to go and hammer into the soil like other woodpeckers would hammer on wood to try and dig out ants from the soil. So totally fascinating stuff. If you're trying to learn a little bit more about natural history, it's a great time to glimpse what you can there. And all of this information and these photos I've gotten from different citizen science projects and databases, including iNaturalist. With birds, I do want to mention there are some other great resources out there. eBird and Birds Canada, for example, are doing different events throughout May, even after City Nature Challenge, just focused on birds. And they've got some great resources. This photo guide was printed out from Birds Canada, where you can type in your address and create a page with the most common species that you're likely to find at your area. So for schools, we print these out and laminate them, and then even have very young students photo identify if they saw a pigeon or was it a mallard and so on. So that's a great resource for you. And Birds Canada is also running the Schoolyard Bird Blitz through May. So anytime during May, if you go out for 15 minutes and look for birds, if you're doing it in the next couple of days, you can submit them for a City Nature Challenge if you get some photos. You can also tally those bird species, like how many of each one that you saw, and then submit it in for Schoolyard Bird Blitz as a class to see, how could the record change over time. We're working from home right now, so how might that compare with our school grounds when we can get back onto the school grounds and see how the habitat supports birds. Oops. Just another excellent resource for you. This is a time when we're thinking a little bit beyond what we've usually photographed. So if you get outside and you think, oh, I'm tired of snapping that same squirrel that's getting fat at my bird feeder every day, you could look in your local streams. So again, very carefully and not disturbing the environment, but if you have the opportunity to turn a rock in the stream, you might see some of these awesome critters, the benthic macroinvertebrates. So these are any organism that lives on the bottom of the streams that we can see. Some of them are quite small, but others are very impressive, and you might recognize already. A lot of people know what the crayfish is. A lot of these are the larval form of other insects, or of insects that would fly later. So the dragonfly, for example, has this big, awesome jaw that jumps out and is a predator under the water before it becomes its adult form as a predator in the air. Our Changing Currents team knows all about these and has incredible resources at ecospark.ca if you're interested in learning about some of the life forms, and then using these even to evaluate the health of the water, because some of them are more pollution tolerant than others. So you can see from green to red here, the green ones are less tolerant of pollution, and so can indicate a very healthy stream if we're seeing a lot of them, because they wouldn't be there if there was pollution there. all of these would count for City Nature Challenge if you find some neat finds. Holly, did you want to add anything about the benthics?
Sure. I just want to mention that I put a link there in the chat to EcoSpark's water quality dashboard program or dashboard. So this is just an ArcGIS map that shows all of the aquatic bugs that you're seeing on the screen, all of the data that we've ever collected since about 2000, I believe it is. And if we've been able to go back to the same site in the same season and get what we call a valid study, so finding 100 of these aquatic bugs or more, we're able to give it a rating on whether or not the stream itself is unimpaired, potentially impaired, and impaired. And so if you're curious about the local streams and rivers and whatnot that are near your area, you can visit our website and click on that citizen science link there to the dashboard, type your address in, and you can see if we've sampled any sites nearby. You can also see what the rating is for that as well too. And of course, if you have any other questions about our Changing Currents program or aquatic monitoring, you can always email us at changingcurrents@ecospark.ca as well too. But I think Dana, you did a great job at summarizing everything as well. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Just wait for my slides there. So again, as we start the project, we're all about collecting species, but then starting on Tuesday, we're going to be looking for a few more days about what it was that we found. With students, you can help them draw connections to the ecosystem services, for example, by learning about which species might be pollinators. If you're looking here, all of these photos from around the world show different pollinators. So the diverse species are alike in that way. And then you can connect it to the other pieces of your curriculum or your learning at home. For our gardeners out there, I know a lot of people are interested in native plants. And one of the reasons that we encourage native plants that are endemic or have evolved in this area is because they in turn support our native pollinators. So we have more than 300 species of bees in Toronto, more than 300 species of pollinating flies. A lot of these are sort of small insects that are subtle and live alone, and you wouldn't notice otherwise until you're looking closely this weekend for City Nature Challenge. Those diverse native pollinators support the plant health, helping them to have a good fruit set, so helping them make seeds, and then the seeds that make fruit are in turn supporting other wildlife and the economy and our ecosystem service of pollination that we rely on for our own food. So part of this big, beautiful story is some really fun critters. Here's one that you might see probably a little bit later in the summer, but I just want to point it out to you. It's one of my favorites. This is the snowberry clearwing, and it's a moth that is mimicking a bumblebee. So the moth, unlike other moths, flies during the day. The one on the left is the moth, the one on the right is the bumblebee. And it's mimicking it because the bumblebee stings. And so birds will avoid eating this yummy, tasty moth because they're avoiding that bumblebee appearance. A great thing to do if you're not sure what to start photographing is to snap insects. So you can photograph insects very close to home. I noticed the ants are coming out, and that's a good one to get. This blue orchard bee, again, because of the observations of citizen scientists, we've learned about how to provide it with healthy habitat and encourage it to pollinate our crops as well. So they've learned that 250 blue orchard bees do the work of 20,000 honeybees to pollinate an acre of apples, which is tremendous. And honeybees are imported from Europe, and so it's not one of our native species. And we can learn about all these different relationships by photographing the insects. In turn, remember the action piece. As you learn more about them, you can learn how to protect them. So pesticides on our food can harm the insects. As you're thinking about photographing flowers, do you have flowers that are blooming all through the year that could support these pollinators? Take a snapshot now and see what's coming up near you. Those native plants that we're so interested in are supporting the biodiversity. So this is how we're getting more species that we can support. The reason is that they've evolved together over a long time with the local wildlife, and they're well adapted to the local climate and soil conditions. So for example, in your garden, you won't need to water as much if you have plants that are healthy with that amount of water. Holly, there's a
Yeah, sorry, I just want to say that the chat feature, everyone, is used for questions about the City Nature Challenge. Please be mindful of that as well too. Personal conversations can be done on another base. So again, leave the chat for links that we're sharing and questions about the City Nature Challenge, please.
Thanks, Holly. Good reminder. All right, and thanks everyone for your enthusiasm. We're gonna leave just a few moments for questions at the end. My slide, 1 second. There we go. This is a really important thing that we can do with City Nature Challenge, is to take photos of plants, whether or not you can identify the plant. Some of the ones somebody had mentioned earlier, garlic mustard, for example, that are abundant right now are actually invasive species. Garlic mustard can take over forests. It actually changes the chemistry of the soils to prevent trees and other native plants from growing. So we want to know where that's coming up and stop it before it becomes a bigger problem. So iNaturalist has a little flag that you'll see if you photograph something and it suggests that this might be an invasive species. It will flag that so we can map where these invasives are, and more importantly, where they're spreading. And even I'll say where people have taken the initiative to reduce them. So we've seen with the Phragmites in Toronto, where volunteers were able to reduce some of that population that's gone down over time. You can get started at home planting native seedlings to encourage more species for next year. Here's a fun project with toilet paper rolls for some of the families who want to try this at home. So again, put your native species in the ground and then see if we can get some more pollinator sightings for next year for City Nature Challenge. Okay, so quick snapshot on what it looks like after City Nature Challenge. We'll have all these awesome photos that people have submitted, whether or not they knew the name of that species. So if you have a basic level of identification, it's best to include that. For example, most people on the left know this is a turtle. Even if you don't know that it's a painted turtle, you could say turtle in your species, and that will help direct this to like turtle experts or people who do know which species is which, so that they can quickly bring that observation up to research grade. The important thing with this is to kind of know your own level of understanding. So the one on the right, if you can tell between butterflies and moths, and you're sure this is a moth, then you would put it in moths. But if you look at that and you're not sure if it's a butterfly or a moth, then it's best to leave that and let an identifier who has that level of skill put it into the correct category, and so on. And if you can get even more detailed in your observations, this is a really great event to be putting in those identifying characteristics so that we can report on all the species that are observed. So in iNaturalist, you'll see that there's a tab called Identify, and you can click on that and it will help you get started with the identification process if you haven't done that yet. So in summary, we're just asking you to get outside if you can. Even snapshots from your window of wildlife would be great help as we try and reach 1 million observations globally over the next few days. And I think we can really do it. It's an exciting project. We're going to fill in this map and have observations all over the place for science. We ask you to stay involved with EcoSpark even after the challenge. You can sign up for our e-newsletter. We're donation supported and bring these programs to youth and adults all around the Greater Toronto area. If you're able to continue to share nature data, we'd love to hear from you. And you can also stay tuned with social media. So we'll be sending updates throughout the challenge, highlights of what's coming in. You can use this hashtag if you find some neat ideas about what to share with others. Thanks so much. Your observations really do matter. Thanks for taking the time to take a look at this today. And here's my contact info. If you have any questions as we go through the challenge or afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out. We really look forward to seeing as all the observations come rolling in. I'd like to just accept any questions in the chat first, and then we'll open it up if there are questions that you have afterwards.
There's one question there, Dana. So the precise dates for the project. So for collection based, it's starting today until May 3rd, and then starting May 4th to the 9th, we'll be going over the observations.
And on May 10th will be the announcement for the global results. So there will be like more official tallies of what people have collected, what was the most common species people saw around the world. Last year it was the dandelion, so I'm curious if that's going to be the most common one again. Are there any other questions? Are you guys all excited to go out? Everybody feel like they're going to take some photos for science here? Excellent. Well, we will be sending out, as I mentioned, the link to both this presentation and some of the resources, so you can find the links. If you're in a hurry and want somewhere to start, check out ecospark.ca, and we have a page devoted to City Nature Challenge there with some other links on it. And thank you so much for your time, and everybody enjoy your Friday. I hope you find some really cool stuff outside, and we look forward to those photos.